Hello and welcome to another classic episode of the album years, about a classic year. Now, but Tim, before we do move on to this episode's year,
Yeah.
you've just been filling me in on some feedback from our 1972 episodes. Now, apart from the usual, how dare you not love my band and how dare you disagree with me and how dare you have an opinion, we have actually made a couple of terrible schoolboy errors, haven't
Awful.
we? And we have to own them.
Yeah.
I think we have to own them.
We've got to own them. I'm
Um,
going to blame you for one and me for the other.
Well, the really embarrassing one is referring to the Stevie Wonder album Inner Visions as Inner Views. Now, Inner Views is the website of our very good friend Anil Prasad.
I think that's what we were doing. I think we were actually trying to attract people to divert their attention to Anil Prasad's Inner Views.
Yeah.
Great site, great interviewer, great person.
Fantastic website, and if it gives us an excuse to plug his website, it's all been worth it. But that is a terrible error, isn't it?
Inner Views was Inner Visions.
And the other schoolboy error that I made, Babacombe by Fairport Convention.
Yeah, because you added it as a last minute.
I know I did. I honestly believed it came out in 1972. I know what I did. I looked at the previous album, Angel Delight, and I saw 1971. Babacombe must have been 1972.
I think you'll find, Mr. Wilson, it was November 1971.
Terrible. Is that the sound of our readers?
That's the sound of every single viewer at the moment.
Terrible error. Anyway, we're going to own those errors.
I just went with you because I didn't know it that well, but I went with you.
Well, I'm sure we've made mistakes like that before, in terms of something comes out at the end of one year, beginning of the next year, and there's a little bit of a grey area. Maybe it came out in America in 1972.
Didn't. I checked on Discogs.
Now, we're doing what we've done a couple of times before, Tim, is we've done 1972. We're going to move forward exactly. Correct me if I'm wrong. We've done that a couple of times, haven't we?
We've done it a couple of times,
Yeah, we've sort of gone 10 years straight into the future. So we're going to 1982 to see what's changed between 1972 and 1982. Answer, a lot, okay? Now, you and me love the 80s, don't we? In fact, we were having a discussion just off mic. They were saying, is the 80s the best era for music? And of course, part of that is because that's when we grew up, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's also, it's just such a great era for innovative pop, isn't it? I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it?
I think it is. It was certainly a killer period for singles in the way that the 60s had been. And there were amazing, unfettered, creative albums. But I guess the thing is that some people did feel restricted and some people were almost crushed by the 80s because there was a greater pressure from record companies. And certainly the one aspect of the 80s I didn't like as much was that there was an emphasis on fashion and style over sound.
And I think that's
sometimes.
what a lot of people remember. And they remember, we talked about this on the 1985 episode. A lot of people remember Live Aid, They remember that kind of, that when music became worthy and a little bit superficial, a little bit dull in the wake of Live Aid. At least that's the way I look at it. But they forget all of this incredible. But it's interesting you mentioned that a lot of people became a little bit lost in the 80s. And I think those were the album artists that struggled a bit. This is an era for great innovative pop. It's not an era for great innovative albums necessarily, although there are some great albums, of course. But I think the emphasis definitely shifts, doesn't it, towards more of a pop sensibility as opposed to an album conceptual sensibility. And of course there are some artists that manage to fuse the two brilliantly, and we're going to talk about those. For me, I think what characterizes 1982, if I had to sort of put it in a nutshell, it's the post-punk generation achieving a sort of new level of sophistication in their music, and the older generation embracing technology and finding new ways to make music with technology. And so let's actually move on to the first category we have, which is new sounds / feel the production. And the first album I want to talk about here, and actually this is a bit of a spoiler because this is going to be my favourite album of the year, because it's so extraordinary. Kate Bush's The Dreaming. I'm in awe of this album. I listened to it again on the way here today.
As did I.
I'm in awe of this album. What blows my mind about this album, she's still, 22, 23 years old?
24.
It's insane. She's so young, and yet the music has got that confidence, that assuredness. It's taking no prisoners, is it? I mean, people sort of talk about The Hounds of Love as her kind of creative high point, and I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah.
I think that's where she kind of reaches that point, that perfect point between accessibility and experimentation. And The Dreaming is a much more difficult record, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a real shock, If Never Forever is a transition album. Because the first two albums are sort of sophisticated, very English singer-songwriter albums that have their roots in Laura Nyro, Joni Mitchell, to an extent, as in unique singer with piano, writing some extraordinary songs. Never Forever is that transitional album where she's bringing in more textures, more influences, but Never Forever sounds like it's from a different decade altogether, even though it was only 2 years before this. The Dreaming is such a confident, fresh, bizarre new start.
For me, it's an album, when I think of the album, I think of the drums and the voice.
Yeah.
And the way she uses those two things kind of define the record. I mean, there's some parts of this record where there's very little else going on. This extraordinary kind of drum treatment, drum sound, very roomy, very live. You can tell maybe she's been listening to things like what Peter Gabriel was doing on the third record, that very kind of roomy sound. But then the way she uses her voice on this record, I've never heard anything else quite like it. Even in her own catalogue, she's playing all these different characters.
Yeah,
there's a sense of theatricality about some of the songs. She's playing roles. 1 minute she's doing this kind of French concierge. The next minute she's playing an Aborigine. The next minute she's playing a burglar. And there are all these little stories.
Well, she's playing a Vietnamese soldier in one of the pieces.
Yeah, I mean, it's just all these different characters she's playing, and the way she's layering her voice, is treating her voice, mutating her voice, and in some places it's scary. I mean, that last track, "Get Out My House," is terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, I think of Scott Walker's The Drift when he's doing the donkey sound.
Yeah.
Kate did it 25 years earlier. She's doing Eeyore, on this. And it's terrifying, isn't it, the way, But then you have these beautiful songs like All the Love and Houdini as well. It's just such a unique sound. And I'm not sure how much... Originally, I kind of was thinking of it in terms of it being the kind of other half of the equation in terms of Peter Gabriel's fourth record, which is kind of his sampling record, which we'll come on to. But actually, there's much less sampling on it than I thought. It is more about the drums and the treatment and about the voice.
There's much more psychodrama on this. There's much more play with dynamics. So even you take a track like There Goes a Tenor, which is quite playful, but where it becomes otherworldly, menacing, is the chorus, which does that trick where the verse is quite jaunty, quite peculiar, and then it pulls down and becomes this woozy, beautiful, narcotic chorus.
And Suspended in Gaffer does exactly the same trick. You've got this kind of almost, music hall waltz feel on the verses, and then this sublimely beautiful textured kind of middle eight or breakdown. And again, just this sound design on this record, these voices, whispering voices, screaming voices, voices in the distance. And I realised that a lot of the things I'd thought were other people are her.
Yeah.
Slowing her voice down, using her voice, processing her voice, but not only processing, just the way she's using her voice, changing her voice, playing these characters.
Well, I was a huge Kate Bush fan. I mean, I bought her work from the very, very first single, so I was kind of following her career as it happened. And Sat in Your Lap was a real breakthrough single. And again, I think with the B-side, wasn't that the cover of the Donovan track, Lord of the Reedy River, as well, which was exquisite.
Yeah.
And this just blew me away. I remember buying it on the day of release, and it was, as much as anything I've ever heard, transporting me to different worlds, different sensations, different emotions. And though I could see that she'd clearly been enamoured of Peter Gabriel 3, and maybe even Rupert Hine's Immunity, I think I can hear aspects of that. She takes these perhaps emotionally even further. There's one other album it links with this year, I think, and that's The Associate Sulk, in that both of them at times are on the edge. There's something quite unfettered.
Unhinged,
you're right. So whereas the Gabriel album, utterly, supremely brilliant album, it's never quite as demented as Sulk or The Dreaming.
Yeah. You use the word psychodrama, and that's exactly what... I mean, I think of tracks like Leave It Open and Get Out of My House. they are psychotic.
Yeah.
That sort of sense of drama is palpable. And again, we have to remind ourselves, this is, presumably she was 23 when she was making this record. She's completely. I can't imagine what the record company said when she delivered this record. As the follow-up.
Well, wasn't it? It was the first time that she'd recorded and produced herself as well. So this was, as I've said, the one word for it is unfettered. And I remember reading interviews with her at the time, and the one thing that always stuck in my mind was that when she wanted a particular voice, I'm not quite sure what track it's on. It might be the one about Houdini, but she said that she'd eaten whole bars of chocolate because she wanted a thickness in her throat, so she couldn't quite reach the notes she wanted to. And I thought that was interesting, that kind of commitment to getting the sound you wanted, because there's a lot of vocal processing, but also there's a lot of amazing natural singing, as you say. Where this again differs perhaps from Gabriel 3 and 4 and Hine's Immunity, and where it links with Billy Mackenzie, is the extraordinary things she does with her voice.
But also there's very Kate things about it, like who else would have a chorister on one track?
Yes.
And Percy Thrower doing bird impressions on another track.
Isn't Rolf Harris on it as well?
Rolf Harris is on the track, although his name's been taken out of the current reissue, funnily enough.
Okay.
For me, it must have been commercially disappointment at the time. I seem to remember. And I was kind of reading an interview with Kate, what she was talking about. The classic Kate understate. The thing about Kate is the album is so pretentious in the best possible way, but she is such an unpretentious person. If you read an interview, she did an interview at the time, she said, I've gone a bit mad on this record. Talk about understatement.
Well, we met her once, do you remember? We met her, and I've met her since then. And the thing is that she was disarmingly ordinary in a way that I think she's in control of, because I don't think she wants to necessarily reveal herself, and I don't blame her, because so many people project things onto her. She's an extraordinary talent, and again, like Frank Zappa, like Captain Beefheart, she's one of the few people in popular music that I might use the word genius about. She's extraordinary. But as a person, she's disarming, because you almost feel embarrassed to be gushing and talking about the music.
And we have to remember the climate she was operating in here.
Yeah.
Today, the world is dominated by female, auteurs, isn't it? In fact, pop music is almost completely dominated by female auteurs. Not then. No. Very few of the records on this list are by willfully, female artists in control of their own vision. In fact, we'll see how many of them there are. Probably not too many, I'm sure. Anyway, so, The Dreaming for me is the preeminent masterpiece. And I think the other thing about it is it's an album that just gains in stature.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that even though she's playing with characters, it's a tremendously emotional album.
Yeah,
Now, I remember being very moved by, as you've said, scared by Get Out of This House. But there's also profoundly beautiful sense of loss. There's a depth there that goes way beyond her years. All the Love.
Yeah.
There's one, is that the track with the telephone voices?
It's got the chorister
machine,
and the boy chorister.
And it is devastating. Actually, I remember playing this because I was so enthusiastic and so in love with the album. And one person walked out when he heard the voice. He thought it was evil. Actually was overwhelmed by the emotion. That track.
Okay. All of the Love, or Get Out of My House?
All the Love.
Really? Wow, it's a good job you didn't play Leave It Open or Get Out of My House. Yeah. We could gush all day about the dream. I'm sure we'll come back to it and reference it the more we talk about this year. The kind of partner in crime in terms of this year, in terms of this album, is Peter Gabriel's fourth record. Mm-hmm. The fourth album just to be called Peter Gabriel. I think it was called Security in America, wasn't it? To differentiate it from the first three. There is a sense of these two albums being two sides of the same coin. The Gabriel album is much more interested in the possibilities of sampling. And we have to remind ourselves at this time, sampling is still this very exotic thing that's not available to most people. This is long before cheap commercially available samplers became available. The only samplers on the market, I think, were the Synclavier and the Fairlight CMI, which both would set you back the price of a house, basically. Peter Gabriel had one, and obviously the other thing we have to remind ourselves is that you had to almost make your own sounds. to put into the sampler. You couldn't just sort of get a bunch of off-the-shelf samples. So, in fact, I remember at the time there was a South Bank Show special, wasn't there, which kind of focused on the making of this record.
There was.
And him actually going out and blowing down drain pipes and breaking glass and...
going to sort of knackers yards or whatever they are, sort of reclaim yards in Bath, smashing things up, recording it,
But I think what this album has in common with The Dreaming, firstly, the emphasis on the drums and the voice, I think that's something they have in common. But it's the sense of drama. The album begins, doesn't it, with that cry. Cri de coeur, if I can be pretentious.
Be pretentious.
Very pretentious. And then that massive Fairlights, a da-dong, da-dong. Rhythm of the Heat, still one of my favourite tracks of all time. One of the most dramatic ways to open a record. Let's just say this isn't Duran Duran's Rio, okay? And that's, again, that sense of storytelling, that sense of drama that goes through the record. For me, this is his artistic peak. And the other thing, of course, he has in common with Decay is that his commercial peak would come on the next record.
Yeah, well, a lot of people thought this was dark. I mean, this got terrible reviews at the time. Again,
really?
This is one of the things people forget.
Wow, I did not remember
because
that.
I was reading the music papers around the time. It was when I got into them in the early 80s. And of course, I adored this. And it was so hypocritical because 3 did get grudgingly very good reviews from people like Nick Kent. Although I remember Paul Morley referring it to as Elton John with a sampler or something. I think he was pretty dismissive of it. But I thought they were both masterpieces, and this in particular, the opening 1-2 of what was originally called, Rhythm of the Heat was originally called Young in Africa, because it's about C.G. Young's experience in Africa, where he's actually taken over by the tribal rhythms. And then, of course, San Jacinto, and I think those are 2 of the most magnificent pieces he's ever
And then I Have
created.
the Touch. I mean, it just goes on, doesn't it?
Family in the Fishing Net. Yeah, the whole album. And it's brilliantly sequenced as well. And at the time, he was seen as this kind of colonialist, ripping off other cultures for his own middle-class purposes.
Wow, was so ahead of his time in that sense.
But very, very heavily criticised, especially in places like the NME. But I obviously watched the South Bank Show special, adored it, because it was that period, because I was still a teenager, and you're hanging on to every word. And these people, because Gabriel would have been early 30s at the time, and when you're a teenager, this is an adult, this is a proper adult who has a sense of the world. And it was also a sense of new sonic possibilities. And I remember in my mind, they were released at a very similar time, The Dreaming and 4, and it was just completely blowing out of the water everything I'd heard before, because you were talking about the 80s being the best decade. I still love those 70s albums, whether it's the singer-songwriter, the prog rock albums,
Me too.
the jazz albums.
Yeah, of course we do.
And they still blow me away now.
Yeah.
But this was what I imagined when somebody in 1974 first heard Phaedra, or 72 first heard Close to the Edge, or 73 first heard Dark Side of the Moon.
Right.
Hearing The
That was
Dreaming and 4 when they came out, there'd been nothing like this before. It was redefining,
creating
your
a
own
new.
view.
It is creating a new musical language, isn't it? Those 2 records together.
Completely.
I mean, you mentioned Rhythm of the Heat, the first track, or I mentioned it too. That moment towards the end of the track where it shifts and all those African is one of the most dramatic moments. Powerfully dramatic, theatrical moments I have ever heard in pop. Sorry if I'm using hyperbole here, but it just, for me, is one of the most dramatic moments in the history of pop.
Well, I think live, I've seen Gabriel live many, many times. He's always brilliant. But what's interesting is he plays something off 3 or 4, and you realise the arrangements, they are so precise, pared down, perfect. So with that, there's nothing much happening. There's the sample, there's the rhythm, and then it explodes. The use of dynamics in that music, and Biko is still phenomenal as a live experience. And although I think he's made work of extraordinary quality since,
For sure.
I'm not sure he's ever bettered the revolutionary impact or the sense of sound design that is in 3 and 4.
Well, and I think there is a sense here that he's on the cusp of... He's taking advantage of the fact that new technology is available to him in a way that it would perhaps never be true again. Sampling, as I say, is a very new thing, and it's only available to a very small elite of people that can afford it. This is all going to change 3 or 4 years down the line. Akai launched their cheap samplers, and everyone suddenly got sampling. But there is a sense that this is before people understand what you can do with samplers.
Yeah.
And he's in a sense grasping in the dark. Here's this new technology. Well, what can we do with it? I don't know.
And doing remarkable things, both musical and non-musical.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to say that's interesting about this, and the Kate Bush to a degree, is that they're not only extraordinary detours for popular music, there's very little of the DNA. So you listen to The Dreaming, you listen to Security or Four, and you listen to what Bush is doing in 78, what Gabriel was doing in 78, there's virtually none of the DNA in that. They have not only reinvented pop music, they've reinvented themselves. The only thing that remains with Gabriel is that he's still got that beautiful, brilliant voice that you can recognise from The Lamb or Trespass. But the musical vocabulary, it shares zero with Lamb Lies Down, Gabriel 1 and 2.
Well, on side 2, there's a couple of the ballads, maybe Wallflower. You could say, well, that's kind of
an extent,
you can draw a line between Here Comes the Flood and to me, it's way, Well, actually, I say that Here Comes the Flood is a brilliant song. What am I talking about? But is there a sense that this album is very front-loaded? The first 2 tracks for me are probably one of the greatest 1-2s in the history of pop music.
I mean, there are extraordinary pieces that then follow. Family and the Fishing, what Haunting.
Shock the Monkey is a great pop song.
Yeah.
Lay Your Hands on Me, Kiss
There's a couple
Alive.
of great pop songs.
Yeah.
I mean, let's say push comes to shove, and I know we disagree on this, I'm going slightly for 3 over 4. I think they're both extraordinary. They're both favourite albums for me. Kiss of Life is the one that is the letdown.
Oh, I love it.
This album.
I love Kiss of Life.
But what was interesting is somebody on Facebook notified me of Tony Banks' reaction to these albums, which I didn't know, because Genesis, of course, were reinventing themselves. But Genesis, during this time, even on Abacab, even on Invisible Touch, even on Duke and We Can't Dance, I can still trace the DNA on tracks like Domino or Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. With Foxtrot, there's still something of the chordal vocabulary, the rhythmic vocabulary of Genesis 86. So, which is why Invisible Touch might be a 1986 pop album, but actually it's still Genesis. Whereas Gabriel, I think, has completely, reinvented himself. But Banks thought that 4 was brilliant, but not as good as 3, but primarily because he thought it was a tremendously gloomy album. And one of the criticisms in the NME reviews at that time, beyond the colonialism and the rip-offs of other cultures, was that it was an extraordinarily dark, melancholy, one-toned album, which I don't agree with at all. But Banks also saw this. If you look at his comments on it, said, only Peter could get away with this. It's incredibly dark, incredibly gloomy, incredibly...
But why is 3 No Self-Control, Intruder, Biko, Family Snapshot, aren't these incredibly dark tracks?
I don't see it.
Not one of us. Yeah.
I
think that's always, not always, but that's definitely.
But maybe there's something that other people are hearing that we're not.
Maybe. Let's talk about, you mentioned earlier, Tim, Rupert Hine. There is a sense that this is the third less known part of this trilogy of albums in a way. Also fascinated with technology, also perhaps fascinated with the way the voice and drums can be used in the context of pop music, embracing the future, embracing the possibilities of technology. Now, Rupert Hine was a producer, predominantly, a producer that became an artist in his own right with these. We particularly love these 3 albums he made in the early 80s, which are Immunity, Waving Not Drowning, and The Wildest Wish to Fly. And this is the middle of that sort of trilogy of records. There is a line you can draw between The Dreaming, Peter Gabriel 4 and this album, isn't there?
Well, they're fellow travellers, and it's one of the only things you can say, because there weren't many. These albums were revolutionary, but very, very few people made anything similar at the time or since. Rupert Hine is the exception, that those 3 albums fit perfectly with Gabriel 3 and 4, Kate Bush, The Dreaming, and Hounds of Love. The second album is slightly less claustrophobic, because Immunity, it depends on the trilogy is so good and so similarly good in a way that any one of them could be my favourite on any given day.
I forget which tracks are on which. Has this got The Outsider on it, this album?
Yeah.
I love that track.
11 Faces as well.
Yeah, brilliant,
This one is opening out more. So I suppose the way in which I see it is that Immunity is much more claustrophobic than any of the others. This one opens out more. There's a lot more marimba. So that kind of no self-control Gabriel feel. There's maybe, when I re-listen to them, slightly more of a classic rock quality in some of Rupert Hine's work than there is in Kate Bush and Peter Gabriel. It's by degrees.
I don't hear any classic rock in Kate Bush
Some
at
of
all. I would agree with you in terms of, you can hear it, it's still in Peter Gabriel's music. Kate Bush's Dreaming, I hear no rock at all.
That's what I'm saying is the difference.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
He will go off into quite, Phil Palmer, traditional
Okay. Right.
rock solos
right.
in a way that Gabriel and Bush wouldn't.
Yeah.
But the technology seems similar, the use of sounds, because again, they're all listening to Steve Reich, perhaps, as well around this time, aren't they? Minimalist classical music. And the use of sampling.
And world music, I guess.
And world music. Yeah, of course. The Afro rhythms.
Yeah.
And Waving Not Drowning, it's great. It slightly opens up the sound. There's not really much you can say, except it's a fellow traveller with Bush and Gabriel, and it's really strong. And also Stephen W. Taylor, who's the co-producer, has got to get a lot of credit as well.
I mean, Rupert Hine, in some ways, is a classic album years artist, isn't it? Because I think we're talking about him in the same breath as we're talking about albums that probably most people out there already know. The Dreaming, Peter Gabriel's fourth record. I'm guessing a lot of people out there probably don't know Waving Not Drowning. And I don't think we're saying it's quite in the same league as Peter Gabriel or Kate Bush, are we? But it's not far off.
No, exactly.
It's not far off. And if you love those records, you probably will love.
You'll
Rupert
find
Hine's
something to be interested in.
I mean, I do love those Rupert Hine records. Not quite in the same way that I love the Gabriel and the Bush records, but they're not far off.
And he's got a very distinctive voice, somewhere between sort of Bowie and Hamill in a certain respects, I think.
Yeah.
The other thing about Hine is that obviously these albums, to a certain extent, do exist under the radar, although I think they were quite popular in Scandinavia, from what I can gather. He did a few TV appearances there. But of course, he became an absolutely massive 80s producer with the likes of Tina Turner, Stevie Nicks,
Howard Jones.
Howard Jones, of course,
Rush,
which is enormous.
I think he produced.
He produced 2 Rush albums, Saga, because Saga were enormous in Germany and Canada, and he produced their mid-80s albums as well.
And lest we forget, Rupert produced one of our previous quintessential album years albums, Sunset Waiting by John G.
He did
Perry.
indeed. And he produced Wise After the Event, Anthony Phillips.
There you go.
Lovely little album.
So definitely, if you are a fan of the Dreaming and Peter Gabriel 4, that era of those artists, you should definitely check out Rupert Hine. I think we're saying that, aren't we? Yeah.
And as we're saying that, feel the production, I think it's that these albums, every single sound seems crafted.
They seem very studio-bound records. I mean, obviously, Kate Bush wasn't touring at this time. I can't imagine. I mean, she didn't play anything from The Dreaming at her Hammersmith shows, 10 years ago now, did she? It would be difficult to imagine trying to... So many voice overdubs for a start, isn't there? Yeah. You'd have to clone Kate about 20 times.
Gabriel does resurrect
Yes, he does.
Jacinto and rhythmic. And as I've said, basically, I'll be watching the show, and it's brilliant. And it always goes up 10 levels when something like San Jacinto, Rhythm of the Heat, or Biko is introduced.
It's the drama, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that sense of drama that those tracks have. They're not maybe the best songs in the sense you couldn't sit down at a piano and say, listen to this, what a great song, Rhythm of the Heat.
Biko, I think, really is 3 chords. It's one of the simplest things that Gabriel's ever done.
I think it's 1 chord, isn't it?
I think he said 3 in an interview. Maybe he's just kind of exaggerating.
I thought it was just a drone and a beat, but anyway, maybe so. But yes, I mean, that's it. But then live, it's that sense of drama, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another album that is very much a producer-led record, a classic record of the era, ABC's Lexicon of Love. One of an early Trevor Horn masterpiece, shall we say. Now, we kind of started off by talking about how post-punk seems to be mutating into something much more sophisticated. We're going to talk about Roxy Music's Avalon later on, which in a way is kind of a signifier of all this that's going on here. Because Roxy have gone from being very arch, very art school, very Dadaist, to being this incredible kind of sophisticated lounge. Everything you always imagine Brian Ferry wanted to be, in a way.
Yeah. I've got a great analogy for them later.
Okay, go on then. Well, maybe we can. I mean, this Avalon is in this category too. Feel the production. Maybe we can talk about ABC and the Avalon record in the same breath, because for me they're kind of they are similar. ABC 4 years before were an industrial band from Sheffield, making music more akin to Cabaret Voltaire or Clock DVA, and suddenly they're making this incredibly lush, romantic, orchestrated, sophisticated pop record.
Yeah.
But they've done that within the space of 4 years, whereas Roxy took them 10 years to get to that point. And the production, it is a producer's record, isn't it? It's Trevor flexing it. But people forget, I think later on Trevor became known as someone that very much involved with technology and sampling. This is still very organic. This is real musicians playing in a studio. I know because I've had the pleasure to remix the album. Real drummer, real strings, real orchestrations. There's some synths on it, yeah, but it's essentially, very much the sound of a band, but transformed into something impossibly exotic for a bunch of who were previously making industrial music.
Yeah. Well, you can't hear that at all.
You cannot hear that at all. Yeah.
And the thing is as well, it's almost like it, because it is a quintessentially 80s album. Yet it harks back to another era. The imagery, the strings, there's almost that kind of Sinatra for sure.
Yeah.
And he's got a great voice, and they pull it off with panache. I think panache is the word for this album. Great songs, great arrangements, and almost again this return to this kind of glamorous entertainment of almost pre-rock, pre-psychedelic music. And they pull it off. Fry has got the voice. And clearly, if you ever read him in interview as well, he had the conceptual chops. I mean, that was the thing that basically, he produced a great pop album, but when you read the interviews, you were almost getting a communist manifesto, But
it is a perfect storm, isn't it? Because, like you say, they came in with these great songs.
Yeah.
Which presumably they'd been working on for a few years before that. And I think they tried them out with different producers. In fact, I think there's an early version of Tears Are Not Enough produced by someone else. And then they've come in with these great songs. They've got Trevor Horn, who is just poised to take over the pop world in terms of his sound, his aesthetic, his production is going to change the sound of pop music. And again, I don't mean that to sound like hyperbole. I think it is largely true. And again, you've got the way that post-punk is mutating into something much more romantic. And the new romantic scene.
Unthinkable. You cannot connect this to industrial. You cannot connect it to punk in any way. And I think that's kind of extraordinary that, people transcended their roots so effectively.
Is there an element of also Thatcherism in here? Without wanting to go to political here, the era of Thatcherism has begun. It's like, everything should be about trying to get rich, trying to help yourself to get rich, to be glamorous, to be sophisticated, to be hanging out in the pool by the pool in Beverly Hills, drinking your cocktails. Avalon and Lexicon of Love. I mean, in a sense, Ferry's had that for a while, hasn't he? You just look at the front cover. Is it Another Time, Another Place, where he's got the tux and he's standing by the pool? This is like 5-6 years before that, isn't it? There's a sense that these records have that kind of aspirational quality to them, which for me, I do associate with Thatcherism. And maybe that's one of the good things that came out of Thatcherism.
Harry Enfield's loads of money, but with more class.
Yeah. But there is that aspirational sense, isn't there? That we've got the sophistication, we've got the money, we're going to flaunt it.
Yeah, completely. Although I think you're right. I think Ferry was always aspirational. You can hear it. My analogy for Roxy Music. So they were an extraordinary band, as we said before. The first album that we reviewed. This is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because their first album was in their last podcast. Their last album, it's in this podcast.
It's their last album, right? Yeah.
Yeah, last studio album. Yeah. So that's the 10 years. And once more, it's really difficult, although Ferry's still an extraordinary voice, it's difficult to see that much of a connection. Because you listen to that first album, as we said, something like, whatever, let's say there's 8 pieces, but there's potentially 16 musical directions they could have gone into as a result of it. And I think it's like a raw soup. You've got your carrots, you've got your parsnips, you've got your turnips. And they're all existing in this raw soup. Avalon, it's the chef's delicacy blended soup. So it's all of those things.
Okay.
But they're blended into a mush that tastes beautiful. But you can't tell the distinct ingredients. Whereas I think on the first album, you can see they're coming from psychedelia, rock and roll, underground, soul. You can hear it all.
Right.
you can't hear anything. Avalon is this perfect blended soup mush of sound.
It is like an immaculately
It's
sculpted...
a Michelin-starred blended soup.
I mean, it's immaculately produced, isn't
Yeah.
it? I think Bob Claremountain was the engineer. I'm guessing
Could have been.
Self-produced. Is it self-produced? Anyway, I haven't done my research on this. But it just sounds beautiful.
Rhett Davies is always involved with them.
Could well be. But Bob Claremountain's fingerprints are all over this. And I think he's recently remixed it into Atmos as well. It sounds immaculate, even though there's not a lot going on. No. It's very painterly, very sparse. But it just sounds beautiful. The space, the reverbs are all immaculate. And it's almost like the videos. It's the audio equivalent of the videos. If you look at the videos, the clothing. Although Brian Ferry, in his videos, he always looks like he's on the verge of having a stroke. Do you know what I mean? He's in the middle of a stroke. He's got this weird kind of look about it. But again, it is that kind of aspiration, which is a very early 80s thing, that kind of aspiration.
It's ethereal, it's immaculate, it's poised.
It's coffee table. It's the perfect album to put on at the back of your cocktail party.
And it still sounds great.
It still sounds great, although perhaps, has it got the substance too?
I think it has. I mean, the one thing about this is, it's like, whereas you can hear all the ingredients in the early Roxy, maybe the problem with this is, beautiful album, and a personal favourite, is that really Ferry comes across as the dominant figure. In effect, it's Ferry's distinctiveness that is lording over the whole album. And it becomes the blueprint for what he does. You know, Boys and Girls, which we failed to mention in 1995, is another great album, but it's Avalon 2.0. Yeah,
there is a sense that Phil Manzanera, Andy Mackay, they're still there, they're still present, but they feel like they've just been relegated a little bit to the role of session players. And I don't mean that to denigrate them at all. And both amazing musicians. But I think you're right. There is a sense that Brian is getting his own way and that he's pushing himself. A bit like Japan did, you know, that you had these incredible musicians, but it was always David Sylvian on the cover, always thrust to the forefront. And I think there's a little bit of that going on here, isn't there?
And I think that, you know, when Ferry did Boys and Girls, it was almost like, I can do this by myself. And I often wonder as well, because Gilmour plays a really strong role on Boys and Girls. And I kind of wonder, it's like, I know that Manzanera had an interest in Gilmour's work and early Floyd, so did Andy Mackay, whether it was almost like this, I can get him to do what you did.
A bit like when Roger Waters left Pink Floyd.
Eric Clapton.
Okay, now I'm going to get Eric Clapton. Now I'm going to get Jeff Beck. Yeah, I don't need David Gilmour.
Exactly that. I thought, you know, was there some kind of one-upmanship?
But it's never quite the same, is it? There's always something intangible at a chemistry of a band.
Although I got to say, I think Boys and Girls almost pulls it off. It's almost as good as
record,
Avalon. Right. Whereas, you know, for me, Pros and Cons, great album though it is, it doesn't, for me, compete with The Final Cut or The Wall.
There is another album I'm going to throw into the Peter Gabriel for the Dreaming Rupert Hine sort of the Venn diagram. Laurie Anderson's Big Science. Now, it's obviously a much more understated, intimate, sparse sounding record. It's a smaller sounding record, but there's something similar going on in the sense that this is an album that is telling stories.
Yeah,
it's got very theatrical. I mean, obviously, Laurie Anderson famously started off really much more of as a performance artist than a musician. And Big Science, her record from this year, is essentially her studio interpretations of some of the more, shall we say, substantial song-orientated material from the United States of America, song cycle. And famously, of course, Oh Superman, the strangest top 2 hit single, I think, ever. I don't think anyone could challenge that. That is the strangest song ever to get to
top
number
5,
2.
I think, for number 2. I mean, Ghost got top 5. I think that's really
well,
strange.
Ghost Town as well by Specials. But I think Oh Superman's got to trump them all, right?
It's extraordinary, yeah.
It's just the most bizarre thing to have ever got to number 2 in the charts.
And you can see that, you know, she was blown by Einstein on the Beach. I think that was one of her formative
and Robert
influences.
Ashley and people like that.
Yeah, Robert Ashley. And you can see how that's impacted. And she does. She takes Avant-Garde to the top of the charts.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
What a trick to pull. And we talk about, you know, some bands being, or Radiohead being a Trojan horse for bringing the avant-garde to the mainstream. Laurie Anderson, what she's doing in 1982 with Oh Superman.
It's great. I mean, I love this album. You know, Big Science. And you're right, it fits in with those albums, but I don't think it's quite as polished in terms of the reverbs,
No,
the
it's
amount
not.
of sound.
No, that's what I mean. It's a more intimate,
Do you know
smaller
what
sound.
it reminds me of?
Yeah.
To an extent, it reminds me of North Star by Philip Glass, where it's got a particular soundscape that she explores throughout the album. And I love that soundscape. So, no complaints.
There's very little on most of the tracks. I think that's
Yeah.
the difference. Is whereas you almost feel with Kate, she's throwing in like 100 overdubs,
Yeah.
mostly drums and vocal. To be fair, on her record, with Laurie's record, you feel like just two or three, very painterly approached to two or
Yes.
three things is enough to make it work. And there is a sense that she's just bringing her live show into her one man show, one woman show into the studio
And
environment.
as you say, it's got that storytelling quality
Yeah.
as well. I mean, definitely it's a contender for, perhaps lyrical triumph of the year.
Yeah, amazing lyrics, funny.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that again is, you don't laugh at Peter Gabriel 4 and you don't laugh at The Dreaming. You're kind of terrified by them. You actually
Yeah.
laugh out loud sometimes.
Yeah, well, I've seen Laurie Anderson live many, many times. I think it's one of the things that people don't get is that she's actually got brilliant comic timing. So, you can be carried away with something because she's got this hypnotic voice and you're carried away and then she will make that joke.
Yeah, I love it.
And
when
she
does that.
drops it just
Yeah.
at the right time.
Yeah.
She's the Seinfeld of pop.
It's incredibly dry and delivered
Yeah.
incredibly deadpan, but it's funny.
Very
I mean,
much.
the whole Oh Superman thing with the... unfortunately, the one thing about Oh Superman, I think a reason a lot of people bought it is because they thought it was a funny novelty record,
Yes, yeah.
Drive your friends crazy buying Oh Superman. But at the same time, probably a lot of people bought it and it was a gateway. Hopefully, it was a gateway to this whole world of Laurie Anderson and performance art. There's a couple of other entries we've got in the field of production category. Funboy 3's first album, I wasn't so familiar with. I mean, I remember the singles, the singles they did with Bananarama around the same time. In fact, I think they're on they start the record, don't they? One of the songs starts the record anyway. I listened to this record, and do you know what I thought? I thought, my God, this is doing what Tom Waits did the following year with Swordfish Trombones.
Yeah.
It's all the kind of junkyard percussion thing, isn't it? And approaching drums in a very interesting, well, like I say, the junkyard thing, which Tom Waits completely embraced on. I wonder if he listened to this record while he was making Swordfish Trombones.
It's a great album because it was such a huge hit. People forget how inventive and how unusual it is. As an album, you're right, it's quite extraordinary, quite creative, deserves to be put into this category with Gabriel, Bush, Rupert Hine, Laurie Anderson. Very clever. And I suppose the other similarity is it's rhythm and voice heavy.
Very much, yes. Yeah.
And yes, you're right, it's got this kind of clattering junkyard quality that Tom Yates.
Tom
Waits.
Yates! Oh
Do you know
my
Tom Yates?
God!
Do you know Tom Yates?
Schoolboy era, number one. Okay.
Tom Waits
Right.
explores later.
Tom York.
Yeah, it's a combination of Tom
Yorkie
York
boy.
and Tom Waits. Do you remember?
Tom York, Swordfish Trombones.
Yeah,
They came
do you
out.
remember that album? Great album.
Yes,
OK Bones, or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah.
Babacom Lee, 1986, came out in 1982.
I thought it was 86.
Yeah. The last record we want to talk about in this field of production. Now, I wasn't sure whether to put this in this category because Simple Minds' New Gold Dream.
Mm-hmm.
There is a sense that, in a way, this is just a continuation of what Simple Minds have been doing for a long time. In fact, I listened to New Gold Dream on the record here, and it wasn't as different as I thought it was from, say, Sons of Fascination and Empires and Dance, the two previous records. There is a strong sense of continuity, except whereas Sons of Fascination and Empires and Dance sound like they were made for a sweaty nightclub in Berlin, New Gold Dream sounds like it's made for stadiums. And I can't quite put my finger on why, except there's something in the production that suddenly opens up and becomes much more grand and epic. And in a sense, this, for me, this is the beginning of the sound of stadium rock in New Gold Dream. In the
So more
context
so
that I
than
like.
Sparkle in the Rain, because...
Sparkle in the Rain definitely takes it to the next level, and then Once Upon a Time even more so. But there's the beginning of that stadium force, Simple Minds, in this record. Songs like Promised You a Miracle, Glittering Prize. again, there's a little element of Thatcherism going here. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it here, that aspirational aspect that I'm no longer content to be making music for a nightclub in Wigan.
Yeah.
I want to make music for a stadium.
Definitely
I want to bring
there's an
people
opening out. Well, you know what? I mean, relating it to a couple of albums that you've already put in this category, it shares something with Avalon and Lexicon of Love, in that it's got a lushness. The one thing for me that the early albums don't have is that diaphanous lushness which this album has. And you're right that it's kind of on a grander scale. Is it Peter Collins who's the producer of this? I'm not sure.
I can't remember who produced it, actually.
It has a lushness that I kind of tie in with Avalon, which again you could argue is that aspirational quality, and with ABC, with the strings. There's something about this album which sounds richer, more expansive, and there are a couple of great pop hits as well.
Yeah, I think it's the vocal and keyboard department. So the keyboards there's more lush pads, there's more chordal harmonic movement, there's less of the quirky kind of analog synth stuff, more of this kind of lush pads, and the vocals definitely sound like they've got Jim Kerr's definitely reaching more for hooks. There's less of that kind of, Europe fascination with Europe and these kind of obscure references that he has on albums like Sons and Fascination and Empires and Dance that sound very Teutonic almost, that Kraftwerk thing. Here it's becoming a little bit more American, dare I say.
Well, also, Derek Forbes does a major part of the early albums, that really propulsive bass.
But it's still here. And I
think
think
it's slightly more buried, isn't it?
No, actually, that was the surprise. And I was listening to it on the way here. I'm like, actually, you know what? The rhythm section is still doing what they've always done.
Okay.
The bass and the drums, it's the lushness over the top and it's the pop hooks that are suddenly coming in and suddenly making you feel more aspirational. And interesting, I think Derek Forbes was let go after this album, or is he on?
I might be on, because I think Waterfront, isn't that?
Or maybe the drummers let go and Mel Gaynor comes in on the next record. Anyway, that rhythm force is still very much present, and that's what surprised me. I hadn't necessarily...
Because in my mind, the rhythm section is almost buried under this wash of keyboards.
No, it's not, actually. And I was surprised myself listening to it. On tracks like Colours Fly and the Catherine Wheel, it's, it could be, if you took off the synths and the vocal, it could be still something from Sons and Fascination. It's still got that kind of Teutonic, almost krautrock drive to it.